So it should work. All right, I'm just waiting for it to fire up. Here we go. Well, good morning, everyone. Darren Doherty is my name, and this morning I have a very special guest with us today by the name of Rowan Reid. Just get that screen up properly there. That looks a bit better. And Rowan and I have known each other for probably 20 odd years, I suppose. We haven't worked very closely together for a very long time back in the agroforestry days, but it's great to have him with us. And a really big part of the reason why he's with us is because of this block of wood pulp. And it's a brilliant book that he released late last year called Heartwood. So welcome to you, Rowan.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. I'm sitting in the gloom, but it is lightening up here.
Yeah, well, it's great that you're outside, which is quite fitting for all the outside work that you do. You do a bit of inside as well, but looks like you're doing more out than in these days, which is great.
Yeah.
So, Rowan, I'm going to switch over to you as being the presenter. So if viewers can just check in for that. I'll just get that sorted. Oh, that's all looking great. I'll just shift you over to being the presenter. So more and make host. Okay. So with that, Rowan, what you'll do is, as we did last night in that rehearsal, just click down the bottom and share your screen, and we should be good to go. There we go. Beautiful. I'm seeing that come through here. All right. Beautiful. Okay. So welcome, Rowan. Let's hear what Heartwood's all about, mate.
Yeah. Well, there's the cover of the new book. It's what I've been doing for probably 35 years, is working with farmers around the country. And this is a bit about bringing all that experience together.
Yep.
But I guess one of the main issues, and I want to explore that during the day, is that when we think about agroforestry, the way we've been working on it, it's a process. And I know a lot of your work is a process as well. And you don't preempt what the final outcome will look like. And what I find really exciting about that is going into something in an exploratory way and seeing what will come of it. And every farm is different. So although I've used a lot of examples for our own farm, but I've also explored other properties. I'm on a farm today of the Stewarts. You're going to see some more of that. And in Western Australia and Queensland and other places around the world, we've seen properties and using the principles and the science of tree growing against their particular interests and aspirations, and developing something quite unique. And I find that a fascinating process, and probably the reason why Andrew and I and many others have been so passionate about this for so long, about this tree growing on farms for whatever purposes farmers might be into.
Fantastic. All right. Well, you fire away, mate. I'll leave it up to you.
Well, I'll tell you a bit about my family history. It goes back to a farm that my mother owned with her brother. This is up in Walgett in central New South Wales, or northern New South Wales. And that's a house my grandfather built up there. And this is the landscape. It's extremely dry. When it was first settled by white people, it was already managed by Indigenous people across that landscape. And you can see in this photo, there was a bit of a conflict between maintaining the native vegetation, on which our family had made money by grazing sheep in a woodland of fodder species and herbs for over 100 years. And on the right-hand side of this fence line, where there was a pressure to clear that land and crop it. And this reflects the trials and tribulations of a family arguing about the future of their property between my mother and her brother during that time. But this is the landscape that she wanted to retain. And I look at this, it's not a perfect Indigenous landscape. If you accept it's been managed by Indigenous people for thousands of years, and then my family came in and managed it for 150 years, it's it provides some insight to what a sort of sustainable or perennial agricultural landscape would look like, because most people would see that as pretty unproductive. But as I said, our family made money off that for over 100 years, grazing sheep. And I'm interested in whether or not we can get more perennial plants into our farming systems, the role of trees in supporting that, and getting both conservation, sustainability, and production out of that. I'm a surfer, so I'm not going to go and live at Walgett for the rest of my life. It's about 8 hours from the coast, and I have an attachment with a different area personally where I grew up. This is the red ironbark forest. For the overseas people, this is one of our 700 or 800 species of eucalypts. Beautiful timber, durable, very slow growing, but one of the finest timbers. I've used some, and I'll show you a little bit later in our house building. I studied forest science because of this forest near the coast, and what I learnt is that forests are as dynamic as the ocean. They change, and accepting that provides the tool, if you like, to think about what our role is. If something's changing all the time, then maybe we can change it in another direction, which doesn't compete with its naturalness in any way. It just takes it to a better outcome if we're looking at getting productivity from it, if we're looking at getting fire protection or greater biodiversity. And having that dynamic systems, whether it's in a landscape for agriculture or forestry, it really alludes to the role that the people we have in understanding that and then directing its growth in some way.
It's interesting, Rowan. I grew up, our farm, the forest.
Ironbark too.
Pardon?
You're in ironbark country up there.
Yeah, well, yeah, and these it's a very interesting thing, the whole ironbark phenomena in a way, and these extremely isolated populations of tricarpa across Victoria, which I find, you probably got an answer to why that's the case, but I certainly don't. It's a very intriguing question.
We've got patches of snow gum down here.
Yeah,
in the Otways, and that's more diverse. I mean, more scattered than any other species I know.
Yeah. But it's, there's something about the ironbark, though, isn't there? I mean, I know when I drive somewhere, especially if I've been overseas for years or for the year or whatever, and I come over the hill at Big Hill into Bendigo, into the sort of caldera of Bendigo almost, and I come over the hill and I go through that metamorphic cut, and there's I call them my ironbarks, because there's such a stellar species, and they do change so much through the year with all of they're like Uluru. They sort of take on all of these different vistas through the year, don't they?
Yeah, and your forests up there were burnt, cleared, really destroyed, and have come back. It's to some extent it shows how resilient our forests are, but also how risky it is if you take them in a direction where the natural processes can't regenerate in some way.
Yeah.
And so I've been really interested in natural processes of change, disturbance, role of fire, in a farming sense, the role of grazing. What happens when you take, one tree out, 5 trees out, create a gap? What's the response of the forest? And the more we understand about that, we can work out how to grow our new forests in ways that have as much resilience and diversity as these native forests.
A good reflection of a personality type, I'd say. Dynamic.
Yeah.
All right. Well, please continue.
Cut out there for a moment. Yeah.
That's all right. Continue on, please.
So, well, I met you, Darren, back when this book came, soon after this book came out, and that's a photo of me with some curly hair. When I was 25, I think I made a decision that I didn't want to work in public forests as a forest scientist. There wasn't, in my view, much opportunity for innovation, for engagement. We have a situation in Australia, and it's probably the same around the world, that everyone tends to, irrespective of how much experience or knowledge they have of forests, they've all got an opinion about how it should be managed, and it's either lock it up or log it. There doesn't seem to be anything in between where people are sort of saying, well, maybe we should get involved in this public forest and manage it more effectively. So like around the world, we have a lot of pressure to lock up native forests and make national parks. Whether or not that's actually going to deliver biodiversity or water quality outcomes that people expect, I'm not so sure. So as a 25-year-old, I could spend 50 years of my life banging my head against the wall, arguing for more science in the way we manage our native forests. Or I could go work in the agricultural landscape, where 70% of Australia is managed by farmers. There's no doubt that it's the most highly degraded part of our landscape. I can't think of a species, or no one's told me of a species that we've lost in the public forest areas, but we've lost a lot, particularly at local level, flora and fauna from our farming landscape. Water quality, dryland salinity, loss of carbon from the landscape. This is the area where the greatest environmental gain could occur, and I suspect trees will have a role to play. So that's where I sort of decided I'd work in that landscape. And this is the property we bought to explore ourselves while I was working at university, what that might actually mean. So this farm this is a photo of a property in 1987 that we purchased. Half of it's got no trees on it at all, as you can see by this. Along the creek, it's just a drain. This used to be an area with a 30-metre tall native forest on it, but that was all entirely cleared for dairy farming and pig production and a bit of food cropping on the flats, carrots and beans and various other things. And that's the result of 100 years of white settlement. It's not hard to see that it's not 10,000 years, so we need to start looking at alternative landscape management systems that are appropriate at the farm scale. Because we have private land ownership, it's got to work for the farmers who own that land. But ultimately, as we'll just talk through this area and across whole landscapes, engaging hundreds of farmers in doing something which collectively create a landscape that is more resilient, productive, sustainable, whatever the terms that people want to use. Now it's about locking carbon into the environment, getting biodiversity back. But underlining all that, if it doesn't work for the landholder, it's not going to be attractive and has to be either paid for by someone else. I'd much rather see farmers engaged in the process of rejuvenating this land rather than losing the rights to that land in some fashion. Yeah. And so we're going to try and make, I guess my aim was to try and make forestry attractive to farmers. And surely there's an opportunity here. No one can suggest that you can plant trees on this and make it worse. It's pretty bad landscape. And there's a lot of this. And as I said, the greatest opportunity to get environmental gain. And it's the same around the world. We've been with the Stewarts here. I've been over to Africa. They've got degraded landscapes, and trees are certainly going to make a difference. It doesn't have to be a perfect system, but it's certainly a lot of opportunities to get started and get into that process.
Yeah, it's not hard to drive around. I mean, you're probably the same as me, Rowan, driving around, and you see, you look at land a bit differently to through a different lens to what other people do. I remember we had a bit of time over the New Year in New Zealand, and I drove from New Plymouth to Auckland and through the Midlands there, and it's one place on the planet where agroforestry is a bit more visible than others for a variety of reasons, but it's still spot the farm that's got the trees.
Yeah.
It's still very much, which I'm sure, and I'll talk to you a bit more about this later, over the process of your work and working life as an exponent of all of this. It's how successful have we been in getting the adoption? But I'll park that question for a while there.
Well, keep on this photo for a moment, because I was involved in some of that New Zealand agroforestry research. Just as a student, I went over there for a few months. And like you say, in New Zealand, there might be a patch of pines or a patch of eucalypts, but they really are just patches. And I didn't see a lot of sort of well-integrated tree growing into the farms. It was sort of like off-the-shelf packages where someone would say, well, I'll have a bit of this and a bit of that.
Yeah. And
all your work is about designing and integrating, all landscape management. So we use the term here, so it fits, and it looks like it fits. And problem with my profession in forestry and plantation is they like to design perfect systems and go out and sell those systems to farmers. You adopt this, and we know how to manage trees, so you copy us. Whereas I want to start at the ground and see, well, if you started a landscape like this with the landholders that's involved, what might be created? So I'll show you a few photos of what we created, and I can use another farm where we are today to show how different family might create something.
Yeah.
But they're using the same science, and that's what I'm particularly interested in, the science and the practice and the markets and the techniques.
Yeah.
The process, if you like, ends up with a different outcome in each sense. So we build a house. It's probably what most of us do when we buy a property. You've got to get in there and live on the property. This is a split-leveled mud brick, but there's concrete in those bricks because it had to carry a roof that's about 40 tons of sprayed concrete. And that's because our family lost a house in the Ash Wednesday fires about 4 years before we built. So I was intent on building a fire bunker. So this is a sprayed concrete roof over the top. But one thing about house building, you got to choose materials, don't you? And you choose a design, and you want the design, if you're engaged in architecture or you're interested in these things, it reflects your personality and what you're into and what's available. So this passive solar design, fireproof, reflected my particular interests at the time. The use of native timbers, as you can see here, well, they're all recycled, durable native timbers because they're very hard to get a source of red ironbark from plantations or freshly cut at that period. So in creating the house, it made me realize we can do the same thing with forests. We can create a unique forest that reflects the aspirations and personalities of the family who's engaged in it. It's the same sort of story about fitting these two things together. This is all the same engineering and science and timbers and stuff that everyone else uses in their houses, but you get a different result. Something unique comes out of that landscape in some fashion. So that's a picture of the house on the hill as it is today. One of the species we used, we've been talking about red ironbark. So we grow red ironbark because I'm passionate about that particular timber as a building timber, durable. I can't imagine it won't have a really attractive future. It's not native to our particular property, but not far away. It does support a lot of produces an enormous amount of pollen and feed for birds, and so it has that role to play. It's not the best species to grow if you want pasture growing underneath, that's for sure. If you find places in the paddock where it could suit, or you have an understory under there. So this is just an example of you choose species because you've got an interest in them, and then you work out how to grow them and fit them into that landscape somewhere. This is the building process. This taking the red ironbark, taking the sapwood off. And you see a lot of owner builders using poles, and the sapwood, that outer part of the tree, tends to rot off or get eaten by lictus borers or something. So we hand shape those timbers just like they used to with an adze to get those timbers off. And there's a sample of the sapwood on the right that has to be removed, even on a very durable species. Right around the world, the sapwood on trees, the part where the water travels up the tree, is going to rot, and the durable part of these species will be on the inside. So get simple things like that, understanding how a tree grows, what's the durable part, what's the valuable part, and then helping landholders produce that particular product. The other timber we used in the house was Australian blackwood. For the Americans, this is very similar to your koa that grows in Hawaii, and an acacia species as well. And this is a native to our area. It's struggling a bit under climate change, but we do grow a lot of it. It's not as fast growing as some of the eucalypts, but the timber's stunning, dries easily, and produces a really good furniture timber. So these are examples of locally native species that will actually produce commercial timbers that we've used, that you want to grow anyway for other sense. That's some of the blackwood timber you used in a guitar back. There's some beautiful grain in it as well, but understanding what forms that grain. So I'm pretty passionate about wood because there's so much science there, and sharing that and saying, well, how could you grow a timber like that with that fiddleback characteristic in it and have a really high value product being produced by a forest that actually fits that landscape in some way. So that's back to the creek. That's another shot of where we started and saying, well, okay, I'm interested in designing these forests, the species I'm interested in. How can I actually start fitting those together? So we planted trees along the creek for conservation, for shelter, for biodiversity. Darren's gone for a walk, but I'll carry on. And then we managed those trees, as you can see in this photo on the right. There's Andrew there. You'll meet him in a moment down there looking up at a 16-year-old tree. And one thing to notice there's no branches on the lower part. And a lot of our trees we prune up to improve the wood quality. So understanding, what you want to use the timber for, back through, whether it's producing flowers or bush food or timber or fodder, understanding the product has been really important to me. We're working back to see how you might manage those trees to actually get a better outcome. So this shows part of the creek where I've moved the fence back under so the stock can shade but not get into the creek. And we've got trees here now fit for selective harvesting. So top right-hand corner, we've got the eroded creek. We planted the trees for conservation, shelter, biodiversity, aesthetics, and all those values that farmers want trees. There's in this planting, there's no straight lines. It's mixed species because of those values. And then we're asking the question, can we get a commercial product out of that without undermining the reasons why you planted the trees to start? So here we've got sort of the conservation outcomes and agricultural outcomes coming first. But can you get the commercial outcomes as well? So there's a little video here just shows the creek as it was in 1987. I love a chainsaw noise. So we're harvesting 22-year-old trees from the riparian strip. So I hope that got everyone excited, the falling tree. There's
Definitely.
Everyone loves a tree, loves planting a tree and growing a forest, but you go to the next step, it's almost more exciting to take a tree that you've planted and turn it into something else, particularly if what you leave behind is a higher quality forest than what it was when that tree was standing. Now, we're doing more on the science of this, but in this creek system here, we have an understory developing of, I've already shown you the blackwood, our acacia species. We've got a whole range of higher value secondary strata trees that are slower growing, but have a denser foliage, more rainforest type species.
Yeah.
Growing up, you can see them under those eucalypts in the back. They're filling up the gap. So I take the eucalypts out and I release the growing space to those higher value species, and they're more effective in shading the creek, cooling the water, and doing that. And part of the tree that I don't take... This is something
that you couldn't do otherwise, Rowan, if you were not doing selective harvesting of the kind that you're doing, and that's ultimately paid for by your value-adding processes.
Yeah, if that tree wasn't worth cutting down with a chainsaw and pulling out with a tractor, if it was a $10 pulpwood log, well, it wouldn't be worth doing. But you can see the size of these trees because they were spaced and pruned. I can get some quality out of it. So working out what silvicultural management and halving techniques would allow you to use forestry to enhance the forest and get a better product. So that species there was a shining gum. It's probably not something I'll grow again because it doesn't like our climate change situation, our very low humidity heat waves we're getting now. But it does produce a reasonable timber. That's the logging equipment we use on the back of the tractor. It's a 5-ton logging winch, remote controlled. You might have seen when I was felling the tree in the video that there was a cable and belt attached to the tree. That means I can directionally fall the tree wherever I want. And then the logging winch allows me to extract it and take it up to the bench. What happened then?
Oh, that's all right. Just my phone.
And there's a day's work and a proud woodsman, if you like, sitting on his 10 logs. So there's 10 logs that came out of an eroded creek in 22 years, trees that weren't there 23 years before. And so nothing's being lost, if we want to take that argument, but hopefully something's been gained. And as I said before, it's almost, that's only half the story, because what's more important is what's left behind. And I firmly believe that logging can enhance the quality of a biodiversity and water quality, soil erosion issues, and a whole range of factors if it's done in a way, or planned to be done in a way, that actually delivers that outcome.
Which you've been putting on your Facebook lately, a bit of that sort of thing. I noticed that you're saying, all right, well, you've got a creek, you've got trees on it. It's not all about retention. That you've got to have some expression, and that disturbance is a natural part of that expression.
Yeah, and keep referring back to that native forest at the coast. It's dynamic. It's changing anyway.
Mm.
And what I'm doing is getting in there and preempting some of those changes by spacing the trees so they can grow this large in only 22 years. Now, a lot of people overseas think everything grows fast in Australia, but it's not the case. Those trees at 22 years old could be a third that size had they not been managed, and still be planted at 3 or 4 meters apart. It's the management no fertilizer, no watering or anything like that. It's just really guiding that growth, which is totally natural anyway, to put the wood where you want the wood to go, in that sense.
Well, this is the amazing thing. This is mostly thin air that you're seeing here. This is the shifting of carbon dioxide and that miraculous process called photosynthesis into woody tissue. I mean, it's a miracle, but it's the ultimate free lunch, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's very little nutrients. No. Particularly if I take the bark off. The bark got knocked off before they got loaded. But almost all the nutrients in these species is in the leaves and twigs and the root system. From research done, you take the wood out, there's very little removed. It's basically just carbon and a little bit, carbon. It's coming.
I just got a question here. What diameter are those logs?
We averaged 50 centimeters in that particular, 60 centimeters diameter in those logs. That was at breast height, like 1.3 meters up.
Oh, yeah, breast height.
And I've got all the figures on that. I think out of the 10 logs, we got about 18 cubic meters, I think. And that fitted, all those were cut to length to fit into a 6 meter container. And they all went to China. Now, that shocks many people in Australia to think you'd process your logs in China. But these were going for the highest value product, this very thin veneer. It's 0.6 of a millimeter thick. And this is the stack that came back from veneer. And the highest quality veneer factory in the world is actually in China, and it's just near where they make IKEA furniture. Not because of cheap labor, it's because that's where the market is. And containers go back empty to China all the time. So it's no extra hassle to fill one up with logs. And then it comes back as dried final product back into Melbourne. And that timber ended up going into the Australian Tax Office building in Dandenong. And it was a great day when I went to security at the ground floor and tried to argue my way in to look at my timber into the tax. Pretty tightly secured in Australia. And but they finally believed me, and I got up, and there was 6 or 7 floors where every wall and cupboard was covered with timber that I grew, and I could actually see my pruning wounds in there, and my fingerprint was in that wall. And like you say, that's just a product that came out of thin air, effectively.
Yeah.
Wood product that didn't have to come from a native forest, and arguably has helped fund the repair of that creek. And
it's an interesting way of paying your taxes that year too, Rowan.
Well, the thing I like about it, they can't come and hassle me and say you're not running a business. And I say, well, tell them I'm not making a profit, but gee, the products coming out are pretty interesting. So that's one of the things that fascinated me, because we've got a very strong land care movement in Australia. Andrew and I are involved back in 1988 or something like that in groups in this area. We've all been involved for a long period of time. But we haven't been very good at putting land care and productivity together. We have in the cropping lands, where people are starting to look at of ways of doing more sustainable cropping, but not with regard to trees. For too many people, trees are sort of sacred and have to be planted and left forever or something like that. Yeah. But selling this story that we can produce this is a piece of furniture that Alistair McKendrick made, and it came out of that creek. That's a product that comes out of that, which I'm really excited about. And looking at the agricultural landscape, how many more diverse, high quality products whether it's timber, food, flowers, bush food, whatever, can come as a result of planting perennial vegetation.
And this is very short rotation too in this case as well.
Yeah, this is short, and other products are much shorter.
Yeah.
And, if they're not non-woody products. But the ironbark's going to take a bit longer. But if the trees, we always say, if the trees are doing a job, then you don't have to be too restless and keen to cut them down, because they're always serving a purpose that year. You can wait another year in some fashion. So this is milling some of the logs that are coming off farms in this area. This is a 25-year-old eucalypt that was 90 centimeters in diameter. We milled up at a field day. That just shows the equipment that I now use. It's pretty simple, labor intensive, but I'm really exploring getting product out to test with furniture makers and others about whether or not it's how to get high quality timber off farms in some way. And this is some of the science we look at: backsawn, quartersawn, shrinkage rates, and some of the people who are into timber would know this, because if you understand this, you can actually think, well, how can I actually manage and mill that timber to get the highest quality product from it? We're drying timber in a solar kiln. This is a 6.5 meter long triple layer skin. It heats up with the sun, and then a computer controls the exhaust fans to manage humidity. We can dry timber in a few months, well, 6 weeks, in down to an even 10 to 12% moisture content right to the core. And this is what you need to actually get furniture grade timber that won't move. So again, the management of the tree is to get the highest quality tree to make it worth harvesting, but then you've got to ensure that the product can actually go right through to the highest end user, whether it's veneer, as we looked at, or solid timber for furniture. And there's a lot of people who are skeptical. That's mountain ash, a board there I'm testing the moisture content of, 26 years old. If you make furniture out of a 26-year-old eucalypt, most people will think it was rubbish, but no one's actually tested it, seen it, and we're doing the research on the quality of this timber, and it's as good in terms of stability and density as old growth forest.
And that improves if you get the moisture content right down. Well, then the stability increases.
Makes it very stable timber, but it still moves slightly, as all timber moves in changes of humidity. But if it's quarter sawn and got even growth rings, it'll move less and move more evenly, so you'll have less problems with it.
Yeah, which is an interesting outcome of Andy Knorr's work with radial milling, in where that's obviously all quarter sawn, and the stability
initially it's quarter sawn.
But then it gets resawn, but it's inherently stable, even though it comes out of trees that you would ordinarily not even mill.
Yeah, so we just use the bandsaw to release the growth stresses. And try to take down to wide quarter sawn boards through the process. So there's another table. This one might be a more high feature table. It's got some some people might see as defects, but in Melbourne they call this an effect. It improves the timber. So this, just showing this tabletop, which is solid and about 1.1 meters across, that will move just due to changes in humidity in a house. That could move in width about 10 millimeters each year. So you've got to design furniture to actually accept that movement. People don't worry so much about that, because IKEA furniture certainly doesn't move. It's just made out of chipboard. But solid timber products, furniture makers have to understand how it moves, and sawmillers need to understand how they can produce a more stable product. And then farmers need to understand how you can actually produce a product that's worth milling through that process. But I'm pretty proud of that table. I just made it for my son for Christmas a couple of years ago. So you can actually, we all use furniture, and so timber's a product you can use from the fence post to the house and onto the dining table. So for many farmers, they might just be using timber themselves in some fashion.
So this is a point that I've made for years, is that in my work in establishing a lot of plantations over the years, or integrating agroforestry over the years, what made me a better planner and better at establishment was actually going in and doing the management. and then becoming interested in harvesting ultimately and furniture making, etc. And it was especially when I was working early on with Charlie Bovolino, who was back in the Box Ironbark Farm Forestry days in the 90s. We were working very closely with him with his furniture making business, but he was doing milling as well. So do you think that there's a lot to be said about being involved? Because what we usually have in the division of labour is, you are a furniture maker, you are a forester. When you're actually involved in the full cycle, does it make you better?
Well, that's why I've done it, to learn.
Yeah, because you got all these feedback loops that you otherwise wouldn't have.
Yeah, I didn't appreciate how stuff moved until I started making furniture. And it doesn't have to be high-class furniture, but you can learn so much just by going through the process. And in the farmer education program that we run, the Australian Master Tree Grower, after initial day, the second day, and I think we went to Charlie's back in the 90s. I'm really keen taking landholders to sawmills and get them to listen to people who actually do cut up and make boards, so they can say, this is the timber I want. Yeah. And again, if you we'll talk about selling flowers, just talk to the market, find out what the market wants, and then the question for us as growers is, how do we actually produce that? What can we do to improve the quality of that? And
what happens in other industries, if you're a wool grower, you go and talk to suit manufacturers, or if you're a beef producer, well, then you go and talk to butchers, or chefs, so that you can get that feedback. It's really.
But you're right, it doesn't happen in tree growing. It's in forestry. It's very divided, and a lot of farmers really don't know where the logs go that they sell, and more often than not, they don't understand why no one wants to buy their timber.
Well, it's really interesting too, Joel. I think it was Joel Salatin who said to me years ago that of all of the activities that we do on farms, the greatest disparity in value is between growing trees and furniture. Whereas if I produce a sheep and then I produce wool or meat out of that, then the value only increases so much. But when you take a tree and then produce a piece of furniture out of it, for the value increase is there's nothing like it. So sort of that to me adds to the allure, if you like, of being a farm forester or an agroforester.
Yeah, good. And if there's any young people listening, you've got the time to actually do it.
Yeah, well, there's that too.
It's a bit of a catch there. There's another table I made from the trees that you can see in the picture. Just reinforcing that, the type of forestry we're talking about is not, some people are uncomfortable with the word clear felling, but I'm not knocking a whole bunch of trees out and going back to scratch and starting again. And when I learned about plantation forestry, it was more like a crop. You plant it, grow it, harvest it, and start again. In an agricultural landscape, we don't want to start again. We're starting with a degraded landscape. We want to use tree growing to lift it up to a higher level, and then take off some product continually, but maintain it as an increasing level, locking more carbon, more biodiversity, more shelter all the way through the system. But that doesn't contradict the opportunity to actually start taking product out really high value, and like you say, turning it into something like furniture, or selling to someone who can make really nice furniture, shop fittings or other products, and get it through that process. So there's a whole range of species we grow, and some are native, and turning them into timber and then products, and through that process in a farming landscape. I'll just use one more example, and I picked this one out because it's an exotic species, and we've been talking a lot about natives. I've got no difficulty with using non-native species if they perform a function or produce a product which is complementary to what we're doing. And I think the redwood, coast redwood, tallest growing tree in the world in California. We have the tallest growing hardwood flowering plant in Australia, not far from here. The coast redwood produces a durable timber, not very dense at all, not particularly strong, if it does have knots in it, but you can see the clean timber in there, knot free. I planted that, pruned it up to 8 meters, so there's not a branch on that tree up 8 meters up the tree. And it's got about 3 cubic meters of timber in that, of which I reckon you could recover almost 2 cubic meters of that cleared timber. and it'd be worth a lot. And I'm looking forward to cutting one down in the next year as we start rebuilding our house. That's oh, that photo didn't work very well. But down there in the bottom, that's me with my foot in a tunnel eroded soil. We have a lot of sodic soil. Sodic soil is actually highly dispersible. It's called sodic because it's a high sodium content. We're not far from the coast. It's been raining.
It's not a soul.
It's raining for a long period of time, but sodium chloride came leaches down into the clay. The clay is so fine it traps the sodium ion and releases the chlorine ion. There's no salt in this landscape. There's just a lot of sodium. And when that soil gets wet, it disperses and runs and forms tunnels like that. And you can see here, I planted eucalypts on this gully, and they've done very little to stop the erosion. It's undermining the trees in that area. But where I planted the redwoods, you can see there, I planted them when I was 25. And here they're quite young trees. Underneath our picture there, I'm climbing up the tree, pruning the branches off. That's when they're about 13 years old, and they're planted on this sodic soil. And that's last year when they're a little bit older. And this photo shows the two cases. I've got on the left, underneath the eucalypts, you can see the erosion coming out of the soil in a heavy rainstorm. This is at the same day. On the left, the soil's being washed out. That sodic clay soil's been washed out, forming tunnels and gullies. On the right-hand side, coming out of the redwoods, the tunnels happen up the slope further and below these redwoods, but through the redwoods, it's beautiful, clear water. So you've got a tree here that I've found that I can't find a native to do the role. It actually changes the chemistry of those sodic soils, binds the clays together, stops the erosion, and then everything above the root system is actually a really high value timber. So you've got that conservation and profit being married together through there.
Is it a root physiology thing as much as anything else to do?
It's a very fine root system. I think it's got a high contact with the clay, and when roots exchange nutrients, they often use sodium and calcium and potassium, those bases, to exchange nutrients with the soil. And I suspect they're doing that a bit with the sodium, maybe even taking it up, bringing it up, dumping it in the leaves or whatever, and but also leaving organic matter behind because roots grow and die back constantly. And by doing that, they're changing the chemistry and providing more stability in that soil. It's not just about drying it out because these soils become totally saturated during winter anyway. It's something else is happening there as well.
Well, so, in the landscape that they come from, which is very, very disturbed in California and very unstable, to have a species that can live for 2,000 years or so as an individual, you need to get yourself sorted out, don't you, when you co-evolve with that kind of landscape?
Yeah.
So it is somewhat a reflection of that instability.
One of the things they did evolve was this lignituber. Now, we know about lignitubers in Australia. They're sort of root masses like tubers that grow underneath the ground, where so if the top of the tree gets burnt off constantly or grazed, it can always sprout back from this store of carbohydrates in the ground. Coast redwoods are one of the few conifers that actually have lignitubers. Now, in our trees, these are all below the ground, but this one's growing above the ground on a farm in New Zealand. Quite clearly shows. What that says is when I cut the trees down, it just grows back. You don't have to replace the tree, the root system. That's all there, and you can get a new crop off the top of timber, and you can have this in forever, essentially, because as you said, they last for thousands of years, these trees. They're very tolerant. They also root graft together, which helps share nutrients and water and bind the soil up, whereas a lot of eucalypts will grow, their roots will grow in one location and won't really mesh in with the roots of another so well.
They'll avoid each other. That's an interesting thing about, because broadleaves just physiologically, when they're growing together, they avoid each other, whereas conifers don't. Hence, when we tend to do high biomass plantations, we tend to go with conifers because of that function. That's interesting that they would do the same underground as well.
Yep, they do. And if you want biomass, redwoods are an enormous amount of volume per hectare that you can't get with a eucalypt.
No. I've got a question here from John Carruthers. Is the coastal redwood a tree that is best suited to well-watered or coastal environments, or could it work in somewhat drier areas like parts of central Victoria?
Well, how do they do in Bendigo?
There are some redwoods at the old Fortuna estate, which is in the centre of Bendigo there, but always been under irrigation. But it's growing on a stony, quartzy hill. But yeah, you got to have the water. I think the other big thing about the sequoias, or particularly the coastal redwood, is like it is in the Otways. You get a lot of that. They get a lot of precipitation from the mist.
They do benefit from that. That I've been in the forest when the sun hits it in the morning and it rains. So there's those leaves collect a lot of condensation.
Yeah.
But Beechworth's got some of the biggest redwoods I've seen. Ballarat, Malvern, stuff like that. They are in Melbourne, which is a much lower rainfall. Our rainfall here is about 750 mils, but Andrew tells me it's dropping and getting drier. That we don't have those coastal fogs that help the trees. Our trees won't grow more than 40 metres in height, but they'll certainly put on the volume down the lower part. Yeah. And of course, there's always trees they got to reflect the limitations of that environment. These are just examples about ones that actually fit in that system.
Yeah.
So I'll summarise a bit and then we'll explore some other properties. This just shows how the farm's changed over the years, reinforcing that notion of forest being dynamic. And if it's going to change, I'm behind all these trees, there's got to be an active manager, someone who actually is passionate, understands, who's in there for the time frame, keen to pass it on to future generations or future owners, who's actually directing all this growth and taking it in a unique way. And my professional work is mainly about working with landholders to give them the confidence and skills and knowledge to actually help them take a forest in a particular direction. And that's much more exciting to me than thinking I've found the species that's the answer to the world problems and telling everyone they should be doing what I'm doing in something. I've got no interest in anyone copying what I'm doing. Just show them that you can create a landscape, like painting a landscape with trees. We have all different preferences. Exotics here, we graze just to control the grass and the fire hazard and a bit of the weeds. And black walnuts, one of the products. I sell some seeds now, and we know it can grow into a large tree in Victoria. And we started milling our smaller logs, so we understand what wood colour we can expect to get, the effect of our pruning regimes, and through that process, and working out how we can fit, in this case, 2 exotic species. Black walnuts, a slower growing one, poplars, a faster growing one. Dynamic system, take the poplars out as they mature, release space for the walnuts, the role of grazing in that system. So again, thinking of these forests as create things, then direct it and grow it in a certain pattern over time. And there's the willow wood, the poplar wood we're taking out now through that process, and playing around with some markets from light furniture, to some high value markets for poplar. Poplar's got, as you know, has got a really good feed value in the foliage. So when you're pruning that, the sheep come running to eat it.
And it has that really stabilising root system as well, which is...
Yeah, the difficulty is you often got to plant it on some really nice soil that doesn't need any stabilisation. So it certainly won't do that job. We can't plant it on those sodic clays. No. Just for what I highlight, that we're not talking about a few species. We're exploring many. Grevilleas that have this ray cell that runs through the timber. So when you mill it on that radial pattern, you actually get a beautiful figure in the timber. Australian red cedar that doesn't even grow here naturally. It's a rainforest species, grows up the east coast. I reckon given another 10,000 years, it would have made it to southern Victoria anyway, with a shifting continent. But now with climate change driving that faster, I'm planting that, find it's growing really well. We don't have...
Well, the bats are down here, so
the bat, why not the timber? Yeah. So we don't have a titmoth, and I don't want their titmoths because they can keep the titmoth and I'll bring the seed down. English oak, questions, simple things like the faster you grow English oak, the higher its wood density. And that's because of its wood structure. So knowing that and saying, well, that makes sense, because if you go back and look at the naval forests of Denmark and England, they're all on the best quality sites. And 300, 400, 500 years ago, they were thinning their forest to promote diameter growth to get higher quality timber. And a lot of that old forest that is slow-grown timber it's just not true. It depends on the species and its wood characteristics. We need more science in this forestry discussion through the process. So here's your little tour to finish my part of the show. So crossing over that eroded creek, this is music by one of our Otways Agroforestry Network members.
There's a little daisy flower growing by the side of the road. When that flower begins to blossom, I know that winter's losing hope. Can't help but think I ain't far away from that long, hot summer haze. So I might just sniff this flower and while away the day. Here's a little daisy flower for the braid in your long brown hair. With that flower in full blossom, shows off your beauty, oh so rare. Take my hand, show you the way, where the daisies bloom in their own sweet way. So we can both just sniff these flowers and while away the day. We can both just sniff these flowers while away the day.
So I see that, and it just reminds me how much more work I've got to do.
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful piece, though, and it's great to have some local music thrown on in there as well. One of the species I looked at there, which was of interest, I suppose, a big part of this is what's some people would call analog forestry, where you're looking at analog landscapes as much in climates, and the hickory wattle that you've got in there, which is is that part of that vibe that you're moving into, that something like that?
You would have picked up in the book. I had a bit of an ethical debate with myself. Our blackwood is a beautiful timber, but it really suffers from the moisture stress and the heat waves we're getting. And the temperatures have gone up at 1 degree in 35 years, and who knows how much higher they're going to go. I can't see blackwood surviving on any of the best sites and well-watered sites on our property. We're in a bit of a rain shadow. It's a really tricky landscape. It's on the edge, the ecotones of a number of different species, and they're going to move and shift over time in the native forest. Knowing that and planting a blackwood today on some of our sites and expecting it to grow for 40 years into a big log, well, that's a bit tricky, even if it's happened before. So I've substituted some sites with the hickory wattle that comes from up near Canberra. It's a selection that a friend of mine made and found it grew straight, and it's done extraordinarily well. But that seed's going to be in our landscape forever. I've introduced a weed, effectively. It's dropping seed every year. We have a fire. It'll all grow there. It'll be like the blackwood in Western Australia, which is a weed there, and the acacias in Chile and South Africa and California, where they become a weed. They're really hard to eradicate. So even though this came from not far away, it grows northern Victoria.
It's classified as native, but it's not.
Well, so I've introduced it. And same with the Australian red cedar, that'll seed in our area. And you sort of ask, well, the landscape, I've been talking about forest being dynamic, our climate's now very dynamic. And are we playing God, or are we actually planning for a different sort of future if we make these decisions? We do it with our pasture species, and we do it with our animals and stuff like that. So whether you take it to the point of trees, what I won't do, and I'm a bit worried about weediness of some exotics, particularly seeding willows. And that's something that you might have picked up a cricket bat in one of those photos.
Yeah.
I grew a few cricket bats, but I won't plant that again because the female clone that they use for the cricket bat could hybridize, if the seasons allow for synchronized flowering, with a crack willow that's naturally in our creeks around here. Not naturally, it's in the landscape, but it only spreads currently by cuttings.
Yeah.
If they crossed and seeded, the seeds could go rampant and clog up wetlands and river systems all over the area. And that's the sort of weed we don't want. The other ones to watch is what spreads by birds. The black walnuts are a bit of a weed. They drop the seed and it comes up underneath, and they can wash down the stream. But if you produce a fruit that can spread by the birds and take it into the native forest, we have pitostrum, which is a native, but it's weedy in our area because it's introduced from Gippsland. So you've got to sort of think about the vectors involved and whether, and some of the species are going to be okay, and some, the speed of spread is going to be slow enough we can manage it, or the risk of something with a native like hickory wattle we can probably accept. But it's not illegal, but people have to be responsible for their decision.
Yeah, invasives biology is a pretty big topic, and we ourselves, as perhaps the most invasive species that's ever walked the face of the earth, we're responsible for most of it. So, and we are ourselves. It's a very, very big topic. Probably something for another day on a whole nother session. So I had a couple of questions here for you, Rowan, just before we go into the next segment of the program today. This is from George Howson, who just up the road, a fellow agroforester, and a bit further.
George.
Yep, and George and I have worked together for many years. He's got a couple of questions. Thoughts on multiple harvests of timber from Australian hardwood trees, and whether there is much data from farm forestry plantations on this matter.
Multiple harvests from the same forest? Yeah.
So this it does lead me to a point that I will put out there for people. Mark Krawczyk and Dave Jackie. Some of you will know Dave Jackie. He with Eric Toensmeyer. Eric recently released the Carbon Farming Handbook. David and Eric produced a 2-volume set called Edible Forest Gardens, I think about 10 years ago. Anyway, Mark and Dave are closing in on completing a major book on coppicing, which is one, and you touched on this before, Rowan, it's one part of the whole forestry picture that doesn't really get a big talking about. But I think that's where George is going to. What we've done is we've shifted a lot of our focus in forestry towards clear felling, particularly industrial forestry. And when you go to places like New Zealand, a lot of people who practice farm forestry are doing clear felled management, as opposed to the old Coppicing standards approach or whatever. So I think perhaps that's where George is going. So what's the work going on there?
I just spent a couple of months in the UK and went and had a look at some really interesting oak silviculture, which you're sort of referring to with that coppers with standards. I went to a 90-year-old thinning trial, and this is to understand the effect of competition between trees, how far apart they need to be at various ages. The day after I got back to the farm, I cut half my oak trees down because I realized they were far too close together. Oak is a species that if you want to grow it to about 60, 70 centimeters in diameter for a log, and increase of high density, as I described, they really need to be about 12 to 14 meters apart. Otherwise, they'll slow down dramatically before they reach that age. So now I've got half my oak as a stump, and they're near coppicing. I've protected the coppice from the sheep, but I can't allow that coppice to grow anywhere near the height of the trees that I've retained to allow to grow on. So I have two stratas now in the back when fuel was the most important, one of the most important products from forests during the wood age and the steel, they would keep cutting the coppice every 10 years or so, whatever it takes to get a fuel wood off it, to keep it short between the standards which they were growing on for logs. I might do some of the same, but oak's not, we've got some fantastic firewood here. We don't really need oak. But I have been using the oak. I've inoculated the thinnings and using them for shiitake mushrooms. And that could be a product where I thin the coppice back to 2 or 3 stems, grow them till they're about 10 centimeters in diameter, not competing with the standards yet, cut them out, take the coppice and keep it low through that. Also, there will be some root grafting between the coppice and the standards. And so that will actually have both a positive and negative effect. The stump will be drawing some energy from the standards, but it will be expanding the area of the root system, and then whole forest will become a network of roots, and that may help sustain some growth during difficult times as well. That's an example, but you can't do that with Pinus radiata or other species, or you can possibly do it with redwoods because they grow in the dark. It's really about, people will pick this up. I don't like advocating any particular outcome, whether it's analog forestry or this or that or that. It's got to be the result of what it looks like. It's got to be a result of science and design and management rather than promoting a particular outcome. And as I said before, I'm quite comfortable with clear felling. So if you want to grow a eucalypt, you need direct sunlight to hit the ground. How big that clear felled area is and how disturbed it is will depend on the species and the height of the trees in that landscape. But I'm comfortable that people are uncomfortable with clear felling, but if you want to grow a particular forest, you use the techniques, and that's where fire and soil disturbance and coppice and thinning and spacing and pruning, all these are tools that we use to create a forest. What matters is the quality in terms of its land management and the outcomes and the people involved of what you create, rather than saying, well, we can't do that because that's called clear felling, and clear felling is always bad. But it doesn't have to be. It can be of a scale where it's quite good. And so this is the difficulty we have with a lot of the science. People are rejecting ideas before they actually explore and use them to create. I'm using on our property, I'm using exactly the same science I learned about at university, which people like to reject. But the problem is it's used in different ways in different landscapes. It's exactly the same science. So what I've tried to do in the book is actually bring the science and present it in a way where it becomes a tool for people to use, rather than a defense of what other people have done with forestry. I'm not there to defend native forest logging, clear fell coops that are 500 acres in size, if that happens anymore, or to defend certain sort of large scale monocultures. But that science can be used in a way if people want to do the type of high quality, small scale, integrated, multi-purpose forests that we're really looking at in our landscape.
I think the point that I take from that, Rowan, I agree with you, is that when we're bandying around these terms, which I did, of course, just a moment ago, is the big distinction I'd offer here is that you're looking at something that's in a mosaic as opposed to total. So your landscapes, and that's what we've seen through all of your photos, and I'm gathering when we have a look at the next set of deck of slides, it'll be the same, is that you don't have one whole system covering the whole farm. It's a mosaic of different systems which require different all have different treatments and different options for management.
And that's partly why I like working in the farming landscape, because unlike the government or the industrial landscape, we as private landholders don't own almost, there are some areas where individuals own a huge amount of land, but in most cases there's hundreds of farmers in an area. And if they adopt and do all sorts of different things, even if some of them are very simplistic type forestry systems, collectively across the landscape, there is a patchwork, a tapestry that we like to say down here, of different age classes, different species, different designs, different edge effects. And as we'll see on the Stewart's property, when that's done across 500 acres, you actually have really surprising and interesting outcomes where there's more bird species here than there are in the native forest, where there's more productivity and it feels better as a landscape as a result of that tapestry. But on that property, as we'll see, there are small-scale monocultures which have been clear felled. But it is complementary rather than negative because it adds to the diversity of that landscape in some way. In that system.
And it fits with some of the outcomes that you're going to need, a daughter's wedding or son's wedding or a party or whatever else is going on too.
I've got 2 weddings coming up this year. I won't have any trees left to pay for it with my forest.
It's a farm forester's dowry.
Yeah, maybe my grandchildren. I can pay for their wedding. So. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll park the other question from George for later. But so Andrew Stewart is with us.
I sort of wanted to move on. There's a photo from the book of Andrew and I, and Andrew and the family can talk about themselves. But there's been a really good bond, and I really like this. You know, I'm the forester who grew up on the coast. Father was a minister in the city, and I needed a landscape in which I wanted to plant trees. And Andrew comes from 5 generations or longer of people farming this landscape. He did ag science degree and teaching, and he saw a need for trees in the landscape. And going back 30 years, we've had this partnership which has allowed us to explore what it actually means if forestry is in an agricultural landscape. I'd like to think he's learned more about forestry than I've learned about farming during that process, but that's not his fault as a teacher. It's my fault as an agriculturalist. But through that process, we've actually been able to articulate a lot of what we've been discussing. And I think their example, and I've got most of the families here, we can talk about some of these things in the landscape context, which would be really useful to see a couple of things. First of all, I made the point, I don't want people to copy what I've done. My farm is a learning space for myself, hopefully generating some income, developing my thoughts and understanding of science, and then sharing those ideas about the principles. But again, my forest is going to look very different to someone else's forest. By using another landscape where the motivations and interests are different, we can explore those in some way. So I'm going to pass across to Andrew, and maybe one of the daughters can come in there and chip in some as well, and you'll have a look at the photos of Yang Yang Gert. So I'll jump out of the picture for a moment and let these guys take over.
Thanks, mate. Good morning, Andrew. Welcome, mate.
How are you, Darren?
Yeah, very well.
Good to chat to you again after all this time.
Yeah, same. Has been a long time.
You mentioned George Howson's property. Well, that's where I think I first met you when...
Yeah, I think so. It was probably 20 odd years ago or so now. I haven't been down there for a while.
We'd done a site visit for George with the Otways Agroforestry Network, and he employed you to come and have your say and to manage and implement a lot of ideas, and you brought your ideas to the fore as well. And it's interesting to note that George is still continuing, and so I often reflect on that, and so I think that was a good meeting place for us.
Yeah, it was, and George's property it's one of the things about that kind of role, which I suppose is a bit different to how you've rolled. We'll talk about this, no doubt, is that you've probably had a bit more of an incremental approach to the landscape, and it's somewhere where you were born and all of the rest of it. Part of my role as a developer is to sort of go in and go blat, and it's a very different role. And when I look at, and George and I have reflected on this a number of times, is what would you do about that situation now if you were to come back to it again, based on all of the feedback that you've got over time? And I'm sure that's a reflection that you have in your life with your trees. And so I'd like to welcome also one of your daughters with us today as well. I think I've met you before. I've met. Yeah, how are you?
How are you going?
Good. Yeah, good.
And Jill's just around the corner. She's my wife. She's here as well.
Yeah, cool.
Hi, Darren.
Hello, how are you? Nice to see you. I think we met at the Polyfaces screening in Melbourne at the Nova a while ago.
Yeah, that's right. It was this time the movie came out, I think.
Yeah. It was lovely. Here. Here we are, right here. I was going to throw that up. So there we go. Always ready to quickly plug the film. So tell us about Yan Yan Gert West. What's going on, and where have you got us to?
Well, I suppose to work out where it's got us to, we need to understand where we've come from. I'm a fifth generation farmer here, and Christy's the sixth. I'm the fourth generation. Christy's the fifth, and we now have a I'm losing count. We now have a granddaughter who was born on the property to our oldest daughter, and she's the sixth generation here. So our family came to this property in 1905, and at that stage, they've probably been essentially cleared, really, because that's what happened, isn't it? I mean, this landscape, you see that photo in front of us, that's what it probably looks like today. But of course, back pre-European settlement, it was vegetated totally. There weren't any creeks. There were wetlands and marshes and swamps and so on. It was a very different place. And of course, through European settlement and a gung-ho experience of draining swamps and creating creeks and clearing trees and changing the hydrology and exposing the landscape and creating erosion, a whole different landscape evolved. And to the point that, probably in about 1940 odd, probably 2% of this landscape had perennial woody vegetation on it. It had been obliterated, really. So that's where it was. And I guess that my father actually realised that we needed more trees on the property. In fact, going back a step further, his father, who came here in 1905, and after clearing a bit of the regrowth, he said 2 years before he died in 1934, I think I should have left some of that regrowth. I should have left more of the regrowth. And that was the first indication in our family of a thought process about what was really happening with the vegetation, and maybe that it had gone too far. So I think that's interesting in our family history. And so then in the late 60s, my father and a colleague of his thought, why aren't we planting natives back into our farming system? So they started doing it, and on a very small scale. But it was hard then because there weren't the land care groups, there wasn't the knowledge, there wasn't the community support, there weren't land care groups. So they went down to the Natural Resource Conservation League in Melbourne and got their trees from there, and they pioneered putting some natives on their properties because they were keen on birds, and they were keen to have their stock sheltered. And after church, we'd go and look at each other's trees and look at the bird species and the different natives they'd been putting in. So that was, in the late 60s, early 70s. And then after I graduated from agricultural science and worked on the property for a while, and then worked around Australia as a stockman in most states, actually. Horses were in vogue then, and I did a lot of horse riding around the country, New South Wales and Queensland, the Kimberley and other places, and had a big look at landscapes. Came back, and I could see why my father was heading the way he was going, because I saw a lot of degradation around the places I worked on. I saw some good management as well. And I guess that we thought we needed to change our approach more fully and expand on the theme that my father had started with his natives and get that happening on a bigger scale. And it sort of fell into place a bit because land care sort of kicked in then. This is sort of now in the late 80s, early 90s. And so we engaged fully with land care. And then and we met Rowan, who came in 1987. And he was doing some interesting things there about landscape change. So we engaged with that and then progressed to where we are now. So this is our family here that I did talk about, Christy on the left, and then Hannah, our middle daughter, Michelle and Jill. And they're all interested in the place, as a matter of fact. Christy's, well, you can say what you've done, Christy.
I studied agricultural sciences at uni, and quite interested in continuing on with what we're doing on the property here, but also interested in bringing in new ideas. I've done a fair bit of travel. I've been out to Polyface. I'm been in contact with Jonai Farm and sort of learning about new ideas, sort of grassroots movements. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from what different farmers are doing at the moment on the floor. I found my degree sort of lacking in that area. It didn't really look at sort of some of the really new stuff that was coming out that was seen to be a lot more sustainable and ethical and that kind of thing. So that's the sort of path that I'm interested in. And the agroforestry really excites me because I see it as kind of one of those missing links in all of these different permaculture and polyface and agrarian ideas, where it's actually linking up landscapes. So it's not only just about the singular farm that you're focusing on, it's about how can we actually reconnect the whole landscape through farming. That really excites me.
Yeah.
Then there's Michelle, who's had our granddaughter, and Jill, and she can give her background.
Oh, well, I'm a Kiwi. So I moved over here in 1981, and Andrew and I got married in 1986. And I've been involved in running the farm with Andrew since then, with his father to start with until he passed away. And then now Andrew and I run the farm together. And I've always been pretty passionate about sustainability, particularly living that way as well, within our house, about recycling and composting and all that sort of thing, and trying to throw as little gear in the rubbish that we possibly can. So we've brought the girls up with those ethics, I think, hopefully.
It's just good economic practice, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So you're following through what you're doing within your house out onto the landscape as well. So I've always certainly really loved all the planting of the trees. And I think one thing that we forget to focus a bit on properties like ours now is that it's emotionally it's a much better place, and aesthetically a much better place to work and live, let alone all those other benefits that you get, which is your shelter and your shade and all that sort of thing. But
I think that's one of the reasons all of us girls want to stay.
Yeah,
it's so nice here.
Yeah, I mean, we did have a tour here one day where Michelle was asked, why do you want to live here? And she said, why wouldn't I? She said, it's such a beautiful property. She said, why would I want to live anywhere else? So it was really interesting. And I suppose that in the last sort of 24 years, Andrew and I have planted 45,000 trees, and the girls have done that as well.
And the family, extended family.
They've been planting trees since they were about 3 or 4 years old, basically since they could pick up a spade and a bucket. And we've made that landscape the way it is. And we do get a lot of comments now from tours on what a beautiful property it is. And it certainly didn't look like this 20 years ago.
So there's a picture of Jill there. She's actively involved in the sheep management. So it's a 570 acre property, and we last year we joined 1,260 first cross ewes, which is Merino Border Leicester ewes, and then we put a terminal sire over those, White Suffolk and Dorset rams, and produced prime lambs. So we turned off 1,700 prime lambs, which we've just finished selling, and that's that's our major farm focus, and of course, growing trees. We scan our ewes for twins and singles, so we can run the ewes that are scanned to have twins in some of the better and sheltered paddocks, although they're all pretty well sheltered, but we can pick out the really well sheltered places because it makes it easier for them to rear their twins, and we can run the singles accordingly. And that's one of the key things in our management strategy. So, wool, of course, and we turn off about 7 tonnes of wool as well. So, and there's a picture of the place today, showing some of the vegetation where the drainage lines have been fenced out and revegetated. The creek lines have been revegetated. The salt-affected areas have been treated with salt-tolerant species. The waterhole you see there.
This is our daughter Michelle that's just turned up.
Hi, Michelle. How are you? Got something strange happening in your yard today?
Yeah, she's like, what's going on?
Hey, how are you, Michelle? This is Darren.
Hi, Michelle. Lovely to meet you.
You too.
So, and we've fenced out that waterhole you'll see on the right-hand side there as well. And so that's a view of what it looks like today with those rooms of activity. But it wasn't always like that. So these few slides here, Darren, were taken in the 70s and 80s of what the property was looking like then. And that slide classically shows an open and degraded creek line. As I was saying before, there weren't creeks in this landscape pre-European settlements. These were vegetated swamplands, and water was just percolating slowly through the system through soft foliage of sedges and poas and other tussocks and grasses and so on.
So there weren't the channels that there are now.
That's right, Darren, and that shows you what we brought it to in a very short period of time of maybe 120 or 30 years, I suppose. So there's...
It's interesting reading Charlie Massey's book,
yes.
The Call of the Reed Warbler, where he's talking about John Robertson's property, which is to the west of you there, and how just in a few short years the hydrology and the species of complexes of that property in the Western District changed just as a result of set stocking.
That's correct, and so there's been a lot of damage done, but we can turn it round.
Sure.
And here's another shot showing an exposed landscape with a lot of wind erosion and the soil built up along that fence there about a foot or so high. I've had to get a grader to grade it off, so we need to change that. Waterlogging and lack of land class subdivision. That's a picture taken across to our house where we're actually sitting now. So that's an issue where the lack of vegetation has changed the hydrology significantly. And then salting, of course, starts to raise its head as well in these highly dispersible subsoils. And then exposure also die back when you have not many trees in the landscape, and they get peppered from all angles, from compaction with stock and rubbing and insect attack and just general exposure to wind and so on. So what the approach we took was to do a whole farm plan, which we did in the early 90s, and divided the property into its 5 or 6 land class subdivisions. And so we had our land class subdivisions of a fine sandy clay, loam soil, flat, fine sandy clay, loam soil, steep, loamy soils, salt affected soils, and the heavy clay earths. So they were the 5 subdivisions as depicted by the different coloured divisions you see on that slide.
So with that, Andrew, you followed very much the whole farm planning methodology that came out of the Potter Farm Plan period.
Yes, that's right. That's right, Darren. Pretty much. And so, as a consequence of all this, we ended up fencing along the land class subdivisions and revegetating along those lines, and then fencing out drainage lines, the creek areas, and creating those riparian zones, waterlogged areas and salt affected areas, and also there were some remnant vegetation areas, so they were fenced out as well, and connected those trees into a web of trees across the property, as you saw on the previous aerial photograph. And so here's another shot here just showing some of the results of that. And lower in that landscape there, you might be able to pick up some Pinus radiata planted along the breaker slope, and in the foreground is the Yanyangur Creek, where it goes from a very eroded state further up on our farm of 90 feet deep to this area where it flattens out and becomes a salt discharge site, but it's also eroding. But we're trying to we've been trying to rectify that as well, and holding it back with tall wheatgrass and trees and so on, and then to reduce that impact on the soil. So this shot here actually shows a couple of properties, and Christy alluded to the fact that part of our project here with the Otways Agroforestry Network and the East Otway Landcare Group that Jill is secretary of is to actually have a focus on connecting properties as well. So in this shot here, there's actually 4 properties. Ours is a central part there with the circular tree lot in the top there, which is a remnant vegetation area that's been fenced out. The other trees there are along land class subdivisions from steep to flat country. And then in the foreground is a neighbour's property where they've fenced out the Yanyangur Creek, and above the Yanyangur Creek they put in blue gums to stabilise the very serious erosion effects there. And those blue gums were planted in 1993 and harvested in 2007, as were the blue gums on our property in the land class subdivisions in the middle of that photograph, where we also harvested the trees, but that's the coppice regrowth. So we're managing those trees on a sustainable basis to get the multiple benefits of protecting the farm and also some income derived from those plantings.
So one of the things when I look at a lot of the photos that you've shown so far, Andrew, is that a lot of people are intimidated, I suppose, about planting trees, and there's a whole lot of cultural reasons for that that have brought us up to there, which I'll talk about later. But one of the things that I look at from your approach has been that you've really taken a very pragmatic approach to which really speaks to you being a farmer first in a way who has an interest in trees, and that you're trying to, correct me if I'm wrong there, but that you're trying to establish a sort of a pragmatic harmony, that you're trying to harmonise the landscape, focus on the pieces that are really structural around that, and also enable as a result that connectiveness that is currently, that was taken out. To me, that doesn't seem an intimidating approach. If I go to look at a property like yours, I go, yeah, obviously you put a lot of work in, but it doesn't seem to me to be a project which is taking over your farm, which is what a lot of people will look at with tree planting.
I think that's right, Darren. We get that response when people come here. I mean, it's very much a common sense approach, and summarising what you're saying there as well, using the science and agricultural knowledge. So it's not dominating the landscape, but it's fitting it into the landscape. And so we've now taken the property from about 2.5% woody vegetation, say in 1970, 1980, up to 18%. But we haven't reduced our turn-off of livestock and farm products. So, we're in that complementary phase where the farm forestry and this approach is actually complementing the farming system at this point and not competing with it. And that's the beauty of this approach. And when other farmers and land carers and other people come, they often say, well, yeah, it sort of makes sense to have it like this. And people see that particularly when you walk through the property and feel the protection, and see the diversity, and also see the animals there producing, and
feel it, hear it, and it depends on what you're looking at too. Like some people's eyes will go to the 82% of the landscape which doesn't have trees on it, and others will go to that 18. So, I think it looks great.
So in that photo there, Darren, you'll see a waterhole sort of in about the centre. That's been fenced out. We have a policy of fencing out all our dams, and the trees are mainly fenced where the water runs into the dam to filter that water and to protect the water source. We don't plant trees on the bank, otherwise we might get root channels and draining. And then we have a couple of small stock access points to service a couple of paddocks. And the line of trees moving to the left of that dam there, that's another lot of blue gums. And then down in the centre, there's some Pinus radiata, which are obviating some gully erosion, which have blackwoods planted around them as well. And those pines have been high pruned for saw logs. And then just in the corner on the right, there's a heap of natives planted along the Yanyangur tributary there, the tributary of that creek. And they've been high pruned for saw logs, as per what we saw in Rowan's photos, pretty much wide-spaced, high-pruned saw log operation. And around the dam also there, we've got some Casuarina Cunninghamiana, the she oaks, river she oaks, and we're managing those. They're terrific for turning timber. And also there's some blackwood in there which we're managing, and there's a number of trees in there which we're not managing, a lot of understory there for the bird life to connect all that. So it's pretty much a multi-purpose approach and just managing some of the trees where we can and where we think is applicable, and then leaving heaps of trees as well. So it's that sort of mosaic of activity that you alluded to before about how these programs can evolve.
So with your species selection, you've gone with, say, something like Casuarina cunninghamiana as opposed to Casuarina verticillata, more of a local species. Does that sort of indicate again a bit more of your pragmatism and practicality with picking the right species for the right spot?
That's right. The Casuarina verticillata, in fact, in that photo there, at the top there's a row going along there where it's a drier site. So the Casuarina verticillata we've put in there, whereas around the wetter site around the dam we've gone for the river she oak, which would be probably a more productive and grow bigger in that circumstance. That's exactly right. And you'll see right up the top there, Darren, there's a triangular shaped plantation. That's actually a seed orchard that we put in there in partnership with my brother Hugh. And so there's spotted gum there and sugar gum for seed production. And on the outside of that, there's 3 rows of indigenous species to protect that seed orchard and to enhance the pollination. And we're also managing that for a soil log operation. We did get some seed off it, not a lot. We're in a partnership with a group called Seed Energy, but we're now managing that for soil logs, and thinnings will be taken out for firewood. And interestingly, our daughter's partner harvested some of the sugar gums there, some of the things of the sugar gum, and he's a landscape gardener and built a what we call a wild space for a kindergarten down at Lawn, so that he used that native timber to create a beautiful playground for the kids down there. So that was an unexpected outcome of harvesting some of those trees, and it highlights the potential. You get the resource in, and markets are there for different and interesting activities.
I really like the that zigzag plantation through the middle there, the shading. The mosaic of shading that you're getting through there, that'll be a cool one to have as a time lapse through the day.
Yeah, that's correct, and it's divided that once larger paddock into 2 smaller paddocks to make our grazing more effective, and where it sort of goes parallel there, it's pretty much picking up the waterlogging line in these landscapes. Hard to see it in that picture. Yep. It's flat up the top and it slopes down, and you get the water coming out on these perched water tables, about a third or so down the land.
You can see those 2 expressed areas there, which are a bit greener, look like right. Sort of a depression, yeah.
So we're actually, prior to the trees being there, that those areas would become waterlogged, anaerobic, and unproductive grass and pugged by stock. So now the trees are there. Well, they're drying that bit out, and that water has been expressed in the trees, and of course doing that magical thing that you mentioned before, photosynthesis, and bringing back the carbon into the system and providing the shelter. But of course the trees are also being managed for soil logs, and there's a lot of understory there as well, and that's sort of that pragmatic common sense approach we'd like to take. This is a site here that Jill might like to talk about in partnership with our brother Hugh, who works with us on the farm.
So that's just we've just shifted a little bit in this from the same photo as the last, have we?
Yeah, that's right. Just coming up the hill a bit. So you're very observant, and your landscape reading.
Oh no, should be doing it all right by now.
Let's talk a little about right here.
So this site was an eroded dam, and we actually used to have cattle, and they used to get into this dam, and it was it's got a very heavy clay bank around it, and that was slipping into the dam and causing water quality issues and erosion around the bank of the dam at the bottom part there. And so we were, unbeknownst to me, but Andrew's brother was keen on planting some native flowers, and so was I, and we were talking about fencing out this dam as part of our project of fencing all the dams out on the property. And he said, well, why don't we plant some Banksias around this dam and we just put the fence out a bit further? So I said, well, that sounds great to me, because I was thinking about planting some Banksias somewhere. So this is a south-facing site. It's quite steep and well drained. It doesn't really look like it in that photo, but it's actually, that's quite a steep hill there. So we took the fence out a bit further. There was an old tree there that fell over that we just kept there in the landscape for habitat. Yep. And we put in 27 different species of Banksias. We also included leucadendrons, leptospermums, and we put a bit of bush food down in the bottom edge of the photo. That bottom set down there has rivermint, lily pilly. What else have we got down there? Round leaf mint is down there. And I think that's about it. We tried mountain pepper, but that was too dry. Pardon? Pig face. Oh, you've got some pig face up on the sort of towards the dam bank a bit more. And then on the closest side to you, there's eucalypts planted for wind protection, but not sort of too much on the north side to shade the Banksias, because they love the sun. So it's been a fantastic project, because we sort of had a 90% success rate with everything we planted in there, which was fantastic. And of course, we've gone back and done replacements each year. We planted out in about 2010, so it's about 7 or 8 years old. But I'm now harvesting Banksias out of there, selling them at a little produce store at the top of our driveway, but also to local florists and for local events like weddings and land care do's and things like that. So we've probably almost made the money back that it's cost to put the Banksias in the 7 years. We supply Bray Restaurant in Birregurra. We supply them with flowers for their accommodation units. Gorgeous. So it's actually been a really successful plantation, and we've sort of involved the Otways Agroforestry Network in it. One of the guys in the network is our peer mentor for this site. So he runs a nursery, specialises in growing Banksias. So he came up and looked at the site, and he gave us ideas of what would be the best species to plant up there, which he supplied for us. And then he's also come back a couple of times and done a bit of a workshop on pruning and how to manage the site. But now Andrew's brother's quite heavily involved in this site too, and he's quite keen on his fruit trees. So it's sort of become a food and flower forest now, because there's lemon trees and lime trees and an apricot tree and olive tree, and he's got an avocado up there, and so there's all fig trees. He's got fig trees up there. So it's really quite a diverse site now, and the amount of honeyeaters that are up there now is amazing. From the Banksias in particular, I've got a beehive up there. We're going to move another one up. So there's sort of going to be all sorts of products coming out of this. So it's pretty exciting site, really. And a lot of the people that have come to look on the tours can't believe how quickly that site's developed in just 7 years. A lot of them are really surprised it's only 7 years old.
So how does it compete with the sheep for gross margin?
Oh, I think at the moment the sheep job's pretty good. So
it's an interesting question on that particular site, Darren, because it's a deep, sandy, acidic, well drained, highly vulnerable, erodible soil. Very little value to the grazing enterprise, but fantastic for Banksias. So it's sort of matching site with species in that classic sense.
Yeah, and I mean, really,
I think too, when you look at the cultural outcomes that are coming from it as well, in terms of your direct marketing, all of these different links.
Yeah,
those people who go to Bray, there's so much that's additional to this, as well as the inspiration that to come and do more in there to back it up.
I'll tell you what, it's a lot nicer going up there and picking flowers than it is drenching sheep too.
Yeah, well,
there's also a trough system. We have a gravity-fed system, so the stock have access to better and cleaner water. Which I'm sure has been a big outcome of all of this in your fencing out. I often use the expression, you shouldn't have animals drink out of their toilet. And it's one of these things that when you do fence out and then do the backup planting to go with that the water quality just changes almost overnight, doesn't it?
Yeah, the water quality up there is fantastic. Now, it used to be really quite brown, but it's quite clear now. So it made a big difference.
So this shot here is showing, we've got 3 before and afters coming up here, Darren, and this is part of the Yanyangur Creek as it was. And then this is a photographic point. You'll see the post down there. This is taken 5 years later. The first shot was taken in 1994. This is taken in 1999. So this sort of exemplifies the sort of thing that we're trying to do on the property, is to set up a biological infrastructure across the farm and have the multi-functionality coming out of the plantation for the farming system, so that we planted a lot of blackwoods in here to help with the erosion control. And then, there's a lot of understory there, so we get a lot of flowering throughout the year to attract the bird life. And we're really keen on integrated pest management. I think the understory and the overstory we put is an integral part of our integrated pest management strategy for the property. And then, of course, the shade and shelter for the stock. And so
are you coming back in and doing a lot of underplanting later on as the system succeeds, gets a bit more shade, better suited for those?
We have done a bit of that, and there's been a bit of self-seeding, but we plant it all together, so we've got all the understory and the overstory there. And I guess the beauty of the systems approach with the agroforestry that Rowan's alluding to is you have the ability to be able to design and manage accordingly. So if we're planting eucalypts, we can space them. We started off planting 2 per spot, about 75 centimetres apart, and taking out the worst tree, then space the others, which allows a side light for the understory to evolve as well, and to get that layering effect in this sort of system. It's a bit like, I think we think of these plantings being like a zone 4 and 5 in a permaculture program. And so you can see that the trees have been pruned there for clearwood, and Rowan's been through the theory about that, so that we're participating in that. And this shot here shows what it's like today. In the same shot, you'll see the post down there, and there's a family, and I suppose the family, it exemplifies the fact that we've had a family approach here. It's an intergenerational farm. There are other people involved. We're doing family tree planting days for the last 24 years, and we have between 20 and 40 people in September coming to plant, and they come back and look at the trees they planted. And it's developed the property as a great sense of place for a number of people, and that emotional sort of contact is often not talked about or discussed. It's also a bit of a serious small scale forestry thing as well, but it has that emotional stuff. So it has all those different things put into it, and that's probably why our daughters are interested in participating.
It's an interesting thing to me, all of that. One of the narratives I've been carrying on about more recently has been when we talk about our layer of energy in the Regrarians platform. One of the pieces I've got there is that you should plan that you are a perennial species, or plan your life like you are a perennial species, because you are. And that's best exemplified, I think, when you have sheep which have a period of life. You carry their genetics through from generation to generation of sheep, but they're relatively short-lived species as compared to all of this perennial vegetation which you're putting in. And then your family in itself, it's all very much. It's interesting when we get properties which are based on annuals, how people themselves become almost annualized, because they're potentially quite a temporary feature of that landscape, at least a family, and the attitudes that people bring to those places are very different. Whereas I'm sure your family knows every tree has developed, which I think has been the great thing about Rowan's book, is that every tree, every individual species has its own story, and you become part of that story, and it draws you in as much as anything else. So, which is fascinating.
That's right. We'll just finish up with a couple of slides here, and there's a before and after, and this is the third one taken at the same site as it is today. We did see an aerial photograph with that before, but focusing on a bit more detail. Here's another one here with the blue coming along the land class subdivision, and then the harvesting. but they grow back, and so you have this sort of sustainable perenniality in the system that you've been speaking about, and that's what it's like today.
So that was a Clearfeld site, as it were.
Yeah, Clearfeld's sort of little monoculture within a larger polyculture, and that mosaic over space and time effect.
It's been good though for people to see with that, because the coppice grows back so much more quickly.
Oh, doesn't it?
A lot of people that we've had here have been really surprised about, when we say, oh, well, that was only harvested a year ago, and they go, oh, it's that big already. So I think it's good for people to see that, and when we plant trees here, we get a lot of tours where people go, oh, such a long process though to plant trees, and we go, well, look, you can make a landscape change within about 5 years. You can make a change in your landscape. You may not be harvesting that timber, but you're making a change in the landscape.
Yeah.
So this one here is the direct seeder site. There's some direct seeding up there to enhance and protect a remnant site. We won't be harvesting any of these trees. It's just protection and drop down fence for the sheep for off shears. Birds are a big thing in the family operation, and here's a graph here of the different areas that we've done a 5-year bi-monthly data set with Birds Australia guy David Poole, and getting a handle on the species. We've now got 110 species, and we're learning more about how to plant trees to attract birds in better ways. We're really keen on the biodiversity, as you can see with these photos. And this here is that shot there, Darren, is that plantation we saw before that you commented on about how we're getting that sort of shade effect. So we have the saw log understory, saw log understory, saw log situation. The understory obviates the wind tunnelling and gives a biodiversity and the connectedness from one plantation to another as well. Some of the crops we're growing for plantain and clover for the lambs, and the trees can help shade and shelter these crops from drying out from the hot northerly winds. And there's the sheep, getting some protection. And some of the other values we gain, even selling some of our thinnings from the sugar gum orchard for shiitake log production, and seed, and also timber and honey, as Jill was mentioning before. So this is just a couple of other shots of the Banksias, and there's Jill up there talking to our peer group mentor, Mike Edwards, learning more about the Banksia program. And I suppose with the farm production, we're producing about 67 tonnes of livestock products a year, and 7 tonnes of wool. So the thing is that now we're also producing these extra products. The top line there showing the farm products hasn't really changed much, but we also got this other potential and growing here as well. You can see the softwood saw logs at 38 tonnes per hectare, and looking at the total tree product increment of 200 green tonnes a year. So it's the complementary and the additional products that come out of the system, which are a big advantage.
We should have carbon sequestration in there as well.
Sure, it's really fascinating too. One of the things that would be interesting to see is the cash flow outcomes of that over time as well. Because it shows to me that you got 67, I think it was, of animal-based biomass, and then the rest is out of the perennial woody biomass. So your 208's coming out of 18% of your landscape. And it's probably even less of that if you draw it down to the areas that you are getting woody biomass out of. So it might only be 12% or 15% that you've got in actual production forest, the remaining being in that, as you called it before, that sort of zone 5 wildlife sort of stuff. So that's pretty fascinating in itself, isn't it? There's a lot to be said in there about utilisation and what you can get from something that's incredibly complementary to the whole landscape. It's a big selling point.
So I think I'll sign off there now, Darren, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present our farm.
It's great.
Wonderful network and the great things that you're doing, and we feel very honoured that we can be involved, and it's been us a lovely opportunity as a family to do that. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege. And We should do a bit of a plug there, of course, not only for the Otways Agroforestry Network, but for a joint publication that you two got up to a while back.
That was a long time ago.
It was a while ago.
We set up the network in 1993, and it's always been about farmers sharing knowledge and then feeding science into that conversation. So the network is probably one of the largest land care groups in the country now.
Yeah.
And we don't, like a lot of land care groups, we do the opposite. We don't give out money for trees and fences. We invest in people, and then they decide. And the longevity of that, or the impact it has on the landscape, has been demonstrated now after 25 years, that we get a diversity of activity self-funded by landholders that they don't see in other regions, where governments and industry decide what they think farmers should plant, and you end up with a few farmers doing subsidised planting. So I think it's a very... with the Master, which is a farmer education program we run around Australia, with 110 courses involving farmers, seeking some funding from federal government to keep that going at the moment. And we take that idea. Jill and Andrew came over to Uganda where we did that. And from that experience, we know farmers have got an enormous amount of enthusiasm and ideas, and they just want to share that with people like yourself who've got knowledge to feed into that discussion. And we're doing some research in Indonesia about investing in farmer-to-farmer education in that way.
Yeah, well, I'm absolutely convinced with that. I think one of the working in the United States and working around the world as I do, been very fortunate to see the relationship between subsidies and development. I know, and we've got a few of those people on the call today in the US who get Natural Resource Conservation Service funding for, which can be considerable to develop their farms. There's no educational component to that, so there's no pedagogical program in it that almost qualifies you for the next step of getting that funding. Which I agree with you. I agree with you that one of the outcomes that we've clearly seen around the world is that the two countries in the OECD which have the lowest level of agricultural subsidy, and that's Australia and New Zealand, have the most land care effort going on. Off farmers' own bat with the least government assistance. I think that personally, when I've looked at what is available in countries like the United States through NRCS funding, through the Farm Bill and the EQIP program over there, I think it's actually a good thing, and it's a good expression of public money, but it's got that missing piece of, you should do a master tree growers program or something like that beforehand, so that you then actually go through some justification. How do you feel about that?
Well, I've got this image up here, and I look at that landscape, and this is not either of our farms. This is actually in Western Australia, another person. Something like that, which tells a story about the landholder's interests and passions, it's creating that landscape. And that could never be subsidised, because subsidised plantings always come through a conservation-only agenda or a timber-only agenda or something like that. There's no reason why government can't reward this landholder and say, okay, let's measure the carbon, let's measure the biodiversity and reward you. But I'm worried about government agencies deciding what they think is the most important thing a farmer should plant and taking the landholder out of the decision. So if we build up so farmers have the knowledge and are able to negotiate with the agencies and then get funded, that would be all right. But you can't, as we've seen, 3-year funding programs this year, this salinity, then biodiversity, then carbon, and none of this integrated landscape management like we see on the Stewart's property. We all these balance outcomes working well together. And to me, this property is another example, and there's hundreds of them, and you've seen them too. Landholders with knowledge, enthusiasm, and passion, and I like your comment about perennial species, because we'll be here for a long time, and then trees suddenly become very easy to plant. And to have children, well, this makes it even easier to think, 30, 40, 50 years is not very long. Andrew taught me that when he said to the video when I was holding it one day, he said, 30-year rotations don't worry me. And I've never heard a forester say anything like that. They're trying to get things shorter and shorter all the time.
Depends on which end of the 30 you're on.
Yeah. And oh, that's right. And many landholders, once the trees are 15 or 20, they start saying, "Oh, I won't cut them down for a while. I'll wait for some big event in the future and stuff."
Well, it's interesting, and too, I did I went to a bloke years ago in Austria, down near the Dolomites, Sepp Brunner, and Sepp had just rebuilt. He had one of those beautiful classic houses on a steep slope, with the cows and the goats underneath the house to provide warmth. And that house, he just finished rebuilding it, and a beautifully crafted building. And I said, "So where did all the timber come from?" And he said, "Well, my great grandfather planted as part of the ethic, if you like. They 200 years, so they're on 200-year rotations. They planted those trees back then, and they've got a local bailiff who helps them manage the access to that. It's like a community lot, and so he was able to come in to this great grandfathered block, get those trees, mill them, use them to replace the house, or basically rebuild the house, and then had to go and replant them so that, so you've got that. Like when you see and hear stories like that, you realize that, we can do things a heck of a lot better in terms of seeing past our own lifetimes if the resources have been created for us well before. Because I'm sure that, like your children, Andrew and Rowan, when they come back in your great-grandchildren who may be gifted enough to be able to meet you, in their journey, they'll look at your place and look at the resources very differently to how you two landed upon them.
Yeah. It just takes one generation, I think, to develop the resource, and then it can be perpetual. No one has to wait.
No.
And as long as everyone just can put something back when they take something out.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've actually got tours of both these farms coming up.
Yep, great.
And Jill mentioned quite a bit about the tours they run and the response that people get. And if people are local, that's a great opportunity for them to see it. And of course, you can buy the book, and it's got stories about many properties in the science.
Well, you can do that great tour. You can land at Geelong. You can drive out on the Cape Otway Road, stop by for a cup of tea or a coffee and a bit of cake at Ravens Creek Farm there. Beautiful there at Mauriac. Then you can continue along, go to Bamborough, go to your place at the Stewarts, and just have a wonderful day, and come home with a bevy of goods, including some books and some Banksias and maybe a bit of honey, a bit of direct marketed lamb. That's like quite a tour, doesn't it?
Yeah, you've sold it well.
Maybe I think it's more of a weekend. A package.
B&B.
Yeah, there you go. So that's how it should be. Well, I've got way more questions remaining than we have time, unfortunately.
I'll go on Facebook and respond.
Well, I think perhaps if it's okay, it'd be good to have another session with you to deal with some of these follow-up questions that I had listed, because it is a really big topic, and it's sort of, to me, the integration of perennial species particularly perennial woody species into agricultural landscapes is incredibly important. The story is still unfolding, and you see that when you drive around any landscapes in the planet, that we do need to see a lot more forestry development on properties. So I'd like to, if we can, have another chat at some other stage. Please take a look at this book. It's only $49.95 Australian dollars even. So if you're in the US, that's super cheap. And and read it, not because it's great to support Rowan's work and life's work, but also read it because of the stories that are in there. I think it's really good that we start to develop stories and relationships with species in a whole different way. So for that, thank you for that, Rowan. I'm going to just pull back the screen if I can. How do I? Claim host. There we are. Just going to get the right buttons. And continue. I'm just going to go back to my screen now. There we go. And so just and just take a look at this is the forestry triptych that that we've developed, or Andrew Jeeves developed, for the Regrarians Handbook and our outpourings, and looking at the landscapes that you gentlemen and the families have shown us today are not that dissimilar to the sort of some of the visions that we have in our diagram here, where we're saying, all right, well, there's lots and lots of different ways that you can integrate and frame, and that trees really do become a really big framing element in any agricultural, or should become a really big framing element in any agricultural landscape. And so from that, thank you so much. It's been amazing. It's been amazing to have an outside broadcast as well on such a lovely day, and to have both of you and your family, Andrew, with us today. It's been fantastic. Thank you. Love to do some follow-up. Next week, we have Graham Hand, who's just a bit further down the road. Now, Graham's an interesting character because he's not someone I would call a tree lover. And I just want to touch on that, but that can be for another day. Maybe you can come in and heckle him next week. But it would be good to have a chat with Graham. And Graham is the CEO of the Australian Native Grass Association and a holistic management grazing consultant, and works on the cover cropping field and pasture cropping field with none other than Colin Seiss. Also wanted to remind people that we've got coming up a subscription program with Regrarians, so that's going to be released in March, and we're very excited about that as a new development for our Regrarians non-profit. Also that we're going to be in far north Queensland with the Dry Tropics NRM in March. We've got 3 different programs there on different scale properties, sort of the 80,000 acre property we're doing a workshop on, and about a 5,000 and then a 200, so representative properties of that landscape up there. The REX, the version 2 of the REX online farm planning program is coming up in April, and we're starting off this time with a tour of southeastern Queensland, sort of starting off in Warwick, and then going out to Dalby and a few other places out through there, which is going to be exciting for that week with landholders, and then shift back into the online framework. Joel Salatin is coming back to Australia we can't keep him away. He's coming back in far north Queensland with the Fitzroy Basin Association in April. So we're going up there to work with those guys on that. And the next our RON series, which is our Regrarians online program of targeted laser-focused webinars, which are based on the sections of the Regrarians Handbook and others, will be starting on May 1. So thank you. And don't forget the Polyfaces DVD, and don't forget, again, where did it go? Heartwood, this wonderful book. You can even, I think it just costs a little bit extra, and you get Rowan to personally sign a lovely message.
Email me or go to my website, agroforestry.net.au, and I'll sign a dedication in there for you.
Fantastic. And with that, I can't play it, but here's a lovely Maton that I bought for my wife for her birthday a while ago. And this is it's an all Australian timbers.
Right.
The front is Bunya, Araucaria bidwillii, with a nice bit of stripe on either side there, you can see.
Wow. Sure.
And Queensland maple on the back and on the sides, and then a ironwood, which is an inland acacia for the neck. I think that's what it's called. Beautiful piece.
I'm just about to sell some timber to a guitar maker that we grew ourselves, and I won't tell you what timber yet, but see how promising it is.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation to both of you. I really, really appreciate it, and we'll get this out there, and look forward to catching up with you again, both online and in the flesh. So Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Darren.
Bye,
Thanks,
Darren.
Darren.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good.